What's up, Internet? Welcome back to this week. So this week we are reading or finished a book called The Practice of Network Security Monitoring. And the ethos of this book is basically to passively protect a network instead of actually protect, because most companies actively protect their networks, and more and more companies are actually both doing active and passive protection. And I'll explain that in a second. So what are we going to talk about today? NSM is the acronym for Network Security Monitoring, and that's what the author references a lot in this book. So what I've done is I've broken it into 4 chunks. First, we'll talk a bit about what NSM is and also the history behind it. Then we'll talk a bit about data types within NSM. We'll talk about some sensors, and we'll talk a bit about the matrix or packets. So let's talk about NSM. What is it? So as I mentioned, in the past, most companies actively protected their networks. So they had a lot of firewalls, they had maybe some intrusion protection systems or some kind of filters on their routers, etc., to prevent attackers from getting in. And most companies back in the day assumed that this was enough, that they could protect themselves from attackers getting in and they didn't have to worry about attackers entering or monitoring their networks that much. Well, this NSM concept came about back in the early 90s. And I think I have something here, maybe I don't. In the early 90s, basically, I think it was some Air Force group within the Air Force kind of coined this term, and then it actually wasn't widely adopted until around 2010, 2011. And the reason it was widely adopted later on instead of earlier is because like I said, a lot of companies assumed that their network was protected through this active approach. But actually in 2010, there was this thing called Operation Aurora, which it was a China attack on a bunch of companies. And the companies actually that were attacked by this, there were some that were publicly announced and some that weren't. But here's a list of different companies that were in there that were, I saw on Wikipedia, which is Rackspace, BlackBerry, Adobe, and of course, Wikipedia is the truth. Sarcasm. Yahoo, Morgan Stanley, and Dow were some of the companies. But the company that actually noticed it at the very beginning was Google. And Google, when they noticed it, they announced it publicly, saying that they've been attacked by China. And most companies assumed that Google was kind of like the golden star, like the benchmark that everyone else wanted to reach. They said if Google can protect themselves actively, then we can kind of follow their path and do as they do. And they were kind of the golden standard, right? Well, once everyone realized that Google could be attacked by an attacker, e.g. China, and actually, let me go back to this. So the only reason Google found out that they were attacked is through a data loss prevention. So they didn't actually detect the attacker entering the network. They only noticed that they were attacked when they noticed that a lot of traffic was leaving their network out to China. So a lot of data exfiltration was happening to China. And that's the reason they caught this attack in the first place. So once everyone realized that, well, crap, we can't necessarily just actively protect ourselves. We need to passively monitor our networks to ensure that we're checking to make sure there's no attackers in there at that time, because when you have a lot of conversations with people in InfoSec, you start to realize that it's almost kind of like a given, and it's all accepted by most InfoSec people, that every network will be attacked, and every network is most likely being or has been or will be attacked. So there is no perfect network, and it's important to monitor the network as if it were already attacked or being attacked. So that's a bit about the history and kind of ethos around network security monitoring. And the little mantra that the author talks a lot about is the importance of the passive approach. The key to having a strong passive NSM is to have speed. And the speed comes in 3 phases. So being able to detect, being able to respond, and being able to contain an attacker. Once you've detected it, reducing that transition time between all 3 phases. The faster you can do that, the more accurate you can do that, the better NSM operation you have in place. So that's kind of the NSM approach, so taking active and passive. Next, let's talk about data types. So there are 4 different data types that they mention in this book, or actually he mentions 7, but if you go to his blog, you realize that he wrote this book in, I think, 2012, and in 2019 or 2018, he actually revised his data types from 7 to 4. And basically, I'll explain what these data types are. So the full data type is basically the full content. It's the entire payload of the traffic moving across your network. So this is basically the entire story, and you can examine the entire story. It's a lot of data, but when you start drilling down, when you're investigating, trying to detect if there's an attacker there, you can use the full content. Extracted data, extracted content is It's kind of high-level content, such as images and web pages, because there are certain tools out there that actually can help you recreate some of the content, so you can see what web pages were seen and what images were shared. The next one is transaction data. So transactions basically watching the flow in the transaction between nodes, and you can kind of see the connections, and you can see what's being shared between what nodes at what times, etc. So you're kind of watching the quote unquote the transactions going back and forth. And the last one is alerts, so alert data. And alert data you can think of as basically kind of prejudged data that's presented to you as an analyst. And that prejudging is happening usually through some sort of intrusion detection system, so an IDS. And this IDS usually collects all this information and has a bunch of signatures that it's cross-referencing against the traffic. And if any of the traffic is cross-referenced as an attack or a malicious attempt of an attack, what they'll do is they'll send an alert to the analyst and say, hey, there's something fishy going on here, you should probably check it out. And that's kind of like prejudged traffic through the alert data. So this is one of the kind of key points that he talks about in this book, is this data types, because when you're doing an investigation, he actually walks through two pretty good scenarios in 2 chapters where he walks you through the entire start to finish of figuring out how an attack happened. And when you can see as an analyst, what they're doing is they're kind of pivoting from data type to data type based off of where they are in the phases in the investigation. So usually you start out high level and then you drill down over time into different types of data types to figure out exactly what happened, who did it, when it happened, etc. So next we're going to talk about sensors. So sensors are quite important for this passive approach, because in the passive approach, the key is to see the traffic, right? So you have to see everything. And to see everything, you have to have sensors out there that's feeding the data into your kind of analysis portal, your NSM engine, whatever you want to call it. And there are 2 different types of sensors. So there's spans and taps, sorry. And spans are, they're not used as widely, and the author basically argues that everyone should basically use taps. And a tap is basically, think about a tap being between 2 points in a network. So you have the entry point and the exit point, and then you have a node on the inside, right? And then in between that you put a tap, and that tap is basically, it's like a wire tap, right? So you put a thing in the middle, and all the traffic gets fed through this device, and all the traffic ggets duplicated and then sent to the analysis portal. So it's kind of like a spying tool for the network, but in a good way, I think. So what I wanted to talk about here for the sensors is the placement of them. So this is another thing interesting about the author talks about in this book, is the importance of placement of sensors within your network. So when you're putting taps throughout the network, you'll run into a lot of issues, and the main 3 issues he mentions are NAT, PAT, and proxy. So what NAT means is NAT is network address translation. And let me show, NAT is network address translation, PAT is port address translation, and proxy is for proxy servers. I'll explain each here. So first, this is a basic image of a network, right? So we have our internet, internal network, DMZ, and then wireless, and then all the different devices in between it. So all of these devices and these subnetworks have IP addresses and port numbers. So I think there's another graph here, right here, so that shows the IP address ranges for different segments of the network, and also has specific IP addresses for certain devices. Well, the internet and the world, we have IPv4, so IP address volume 4 or version 4, and they only have a limited number of IP addresses. Same for v6. So what happens is we have public IP addresses and we have private. So the public ones are very limited, so they're distributed in a minimal way. So all these public IP addresses are maybe sent to a company. So one company might have 1 or 2 IP addresses. And then what those IP addresses will do is they'll be externally facing to the internet. And then all the traffic that comes into this company, those addresses will be translated to the private IP addresses inside of the network. So here you can see that the 198.51.100.1 is the public facing one. And then you can see inside, let's look at the wireless networks. The wireless network mentions that there is a 172.16.00 range up to 12. So those are the private IP addresses for the wireless network, and those are translated as they go out. So the people on the internet can only see the public IP address, but inside everything is organized through private. And the important piece here is when you're monitoring your network, you need to know exactly the true source of the IP address and the destination. So understanding the true source and destination, you'll have to place multiple taps around your network to make sure you're not being confused or the address isn't being obfuscated through different devices and different translation tables. So I have here basically, I zoomed in on this network, right? So we have points G, B, and H. So these are basically where we can put our taps to ensure that we're as close as possible to the source and destination machines within inside of our network, avoiding any address translation. And the port address translation, I guess I could explain that. I'll explain that here, or yeah, I'll explain it here. So in the wireless network, there could be multiple types of address translation. So maybe each device inside of the wireless network, like a laptop, could have an IP address associated with a port. So it could have the IP address and then a port maybe like 99643 or something like that. And then that port is associated to that personal laptop. So port address translation is just a more specific version of network address translation. And then proxy servers. So proxies tend to sit on the outskirts of your network facing the internet. So they're really, really close to the internet. So when you're putting in a tap to observe the traffic going in and out of your network, you'll have to put it as close as possible to the internet. And a proxy basically is, companies tend to do this internally and externally. So if you're an employee in a company and you want to go to Facebook, say, and you type in the Facebook URL and you push enter, well, what most likely will happen if they have proxy servers is that request will go to the proxy server inside of your network. That proxy server will then collect that information, and they'll actually go to Facebook, and then they'll take the request back from Facebook or the response, and they'll send that to you. So you're not actually going to Facebook, you're going to the proxy server, which is then going to Facebook and then sending that information back to you. So you'll have to avoid that confusion as well when you put taps, so you know exactly who's going where or where they're ending up. Those are the sensors. Last, we're going to talk about the matrix. So this is another part of the book where he touches on when you're doing packet analysis, specifically one of the tools inside of this suite of network security monitoring. And he talks about two things. So he talks about network blocks, network blocks and protocols. So these are approaches to doing packet analysis, and they tend to be good when you use them hand in hand, so together. And the network block approach is when you look at ranges of IP addresses. And then those ranges of IP addresses tend to be purchased out by a lot of these big tech firms or big companies. And you can kind of see, okay, well, when you do the packet analysis, there's a good chance that these ranges are associated to this company. And the same for protocols, but specifically ports within the protocols. And you can see exactly which ports within this traffic are associated to which application services. I'll explain that here. So we have network blocks as the ranges I mentioned. So here you can see that Microsoft, Apple, Verizon, and Amazon, they all have their own specific IP address ranges. So when you see these ranges within your traffic, you can assume that most likely there is something happening with one of these companies. And the same for the protocol approach, where you can actually see that Apple has these two different UDP ports of 16386 and then 3544. So the 16386 is FaceTime, so the application service for FaceTime, and then the 3544 is push notifications with an Apple. So over time, as you kind of get more experience and go through more iterations of practicing looking at traffic and understanding the associations between these numbers and actual brands and services, it's almost like you're seeing into the matrix. When I thought about this, I thought about Cypher in the scene of Matrix when Cypher's talking to Neo. And he says he no longer sees numbers, he sees images, and he can actually see the world in itself. And it's almost like that happens here when you get so much experience when looking at this stuff. So that was pretty fascinating. And last, we're going to end it off here with this little troll looking through his binoculars. The point I guess I want to end this with is that having an active security approach is important, but also having a passive security approach is critical and necessary, because as we mentioned in the beginning, no one is safe, no network is safe, everyone is going to be attacked. So it's just a matter of winning in a certain way. And what I mean by that is you don't necessarily win by strictly preventing the attacker from entering the network. You can also win, which could be almost as important, if not more, by actually preventing that attacker from accomplishing their mission. And that comes in the sense that I mentioned of that speed of detecting, responding, and containing that attacker within the short time frame that they're inside of your network. So if you can reduce that time frame down, accurately kind of respond and detect them and contain them, then you've won in a way. So both the active and passive approach are really important. And this book was a good one. I recommend it. And I'll probably read another one, kind of sort of like it, this upcoming week. So See ya next week.